What if Doctor Strange lost his heart instead of his hands? An episode highly regarded by many. The overall sentiment I've heard, even from some people who think the show is bad, is, oh, the Doctor Strange one? That's the good episode. What If was bad, but that Doctor Strange episode though. So now it's time to find out. Is it really all it's cracked up to be? The previous episodes weren't doing so well. You can go check out my videos on them, which I would recommend because this is the 4th video in my series on What If. And without further ado, we will begin What If Episode 4. We open up to the Watcher saying that we've seen the massive effects of a single small decision. But what if it's the wrong decision? Then he says,
what if the best of intentions has very strange consequences?
Which is the general premise of the episode. Remember the Neurological Society dinner from Doctor Strange 1? You probably don't, because he got in the accident that kicked off the plot on the way there, and never actually arrived. Well, before going, he had invited Christine, and she declined because every event like that was always about him. However, the change this time is that she did accept the invitation, so Strange comes to pick her up. And while they're driving, they talk about what he's going to say, and Christine is a bit more excited and cheery than she ever is in Doctor Strange's movie, but it's not too big of a deal. When Doctor Strange tries to pass a truck that's going slow in front of him, a car is coming the other way. He just barely avoids it to get back into his own lane, and him and Christine sit there for a second. Before they say anything, another car comes up swerving behind them and runs straight into them, pushing Strange's car off the road into a crash. When the car lands, Strange is fine, but he realizes Christine is dead. That's pretty lucky that he got out of the car crash mostly uninjured. But wait, let's go back and look at exactly how it crashed. They put in their best effort to make sure it crashed the exact same way as it did in Doctor Strange. Look at this side by side. And despite that, he is completely fine, didn't lose his hands, and Christine dies instead? That doesn't make much sense, but moving on.
Grief-stricken, Strange sought answers across the world and in the mystic arts.
Oh. So, Strange just, turned to the mystic arts. In his solo movie, he injured his hands, which sent his life on a downward spiral, until he was shown the file of a man who healed from an impossible injury. Upon going to find this man, he told him about Kamar-Taj, and only then was Strange able to discover the mystic arts. Here he's like, Christine died, it's wizardin time. Here he has no reason to find this guy who got healed by Kamar-Taj, yet he found Kamar-Taj anyway. This is the equivalent of,
somehow Palpatine returned.
Although less severe, of course. They give us absolutely nothing, but I guess the most possible explanation is he found a different person that could link him back to Kamar-Taj. But then that makes you think, if it's easy enough to find Kamar-Taj that Strange gets led to it either way, whether he loses his hands or Christine, it's not very secret, is it? Well, the world building around the wizards somehow staying secret is pretty shaky to begin with, but this makes it a bit worse. After this massive jump, we see him reading about the Eye of Agamotto, and he comes across the section about
manipulation and alteration of timelines,
which we'll come back to later. In the scene where Mordo and Wong come to stop Strange from using the Time Stone, the Ancient One is there instead of Mordo. They just kind of wiped Mordo from existence in this episode. The Ancient One dies, then Strange faces off against Dormammu, just like he did in his own movie.
Dormammu, I've come to bargain.
But the Watcher tells us that despite all of this, Strange couldn't let go of his past. We see him up at night holding the Eye of Agamotto. Wong comes to see him, and Strange says that it was exactly 2 years ago that Christine died. Wong says,
I'm going to start the kettle. I suggest you join me before you do something reckless.
But instead of joining him, Strange puts on the Eye of Agamotto and does this. That is not how the Time Stone works. It can be used to reverse specific objects back in time, like the apple, or in the climax, he is reversing presumably the entire Earth except for himself and Mordo. If he reversed less than the entire Earth, there would be a radius within which clocks would now be out of sync, and other things like that. Him and Mordo are not traversing backwards through time, as that's not how reversing the apple works. And if that was the case, there's no way the Zealots could break out of it in the manner that they do. It's an effect being applied to everything in the scene, but one that the Zealots can break out of. And even if him and Mordo were traversing backwards through time, it's not very fast. Here he just opens the eye, and blam, he's now in the past as Christine walks out to his car. Strange is wearing the clothes he was wearing at the time, by the way. No Eye of Agamotto, as we see when he reaches for his chest and finds nothing there. This prompts Christine to ask if something is wrong, and Strange says he just had a mild cardiac event, to which the response is,
"A heart attack, Doctor?"
Which is kind of a strange line. They would both know what he meant by that. What's the point of clarifying? It's kind of like clunky exposition, but you didn't even need to explain that part. The fact that a mild cardiac event means a heart attack doesn't add anything to what he said, and you could have just left it out. They go on the car ride again. He puts on his blinker, but decides against changing lanes. Then a car comes up and rams into them, causing them to crash the same way again. Christine is now dead again, so Strange uses the Eye of Agamotto. Wait, what? Remember when he didn't have it anymore because his entire outfit changed? Well, now he just has a green light on his chest that gives him the power of the Time Stone. So he goes back in time to the same point again for another try. He takes a different route, but despite that, a truck rams into them, and of course, Christine dies and Strange is still fine, despite his car getting rammed into by a truck. So he goes back in time again, but wait, he visibly has the Eye of Agamotto this time. Weird. While on the next attempt, they somehow get to the party off screen. Weird how there's a car crash every time he has tried to go, but this time there just isn't for some reason. But it doesn't matter that they made it there, because Christine then has a heart attack or something and dies. He uses the Eye of Agamotto again, and this time they go out for pizza, when Christine was so adamantly against that earlier.
We'll order pizza.
Oh no, I am not getting grease on this dress, okay?
But while they're eating, a guy just walks up and shoots Christine. Strange uses the stone a bunch more times, and we see various car crashes, which of course all had Christine die and Strange leave uninjured. Then he leaves Christine waiting and sees on the news that she died. He uses the stone again, and there. Did you see it? It was very quick, but the bartender reacted to Strange leaving. I know this seems insignificant, but keep that in mind for later. Strange asks Christine,
Why does this keep happening? Aren't we allowed to be happy?
so she suggests that she should drive. Then they crash the exact same way again, yet Christine dies and Strange survives, despite their places in the car being swapped. After Strange crawls out of the car and screams, he suddenly has the Eye of Agamotto again. Then a blue circle appears in the background, and out of it comes the Ancient One. That's not a sling ring portal, and it's unclear what it is now, but we'll find out later in the episode. The Ancient One says she is here to help Strange, then explains that this moment is what leads him to finding the mystic arts, which leads to her saying,
Her death is an absolute point in time.
and when Strange questions this, she says,
Unchangeable, unmovable.
but Strange has changed it in a bunch of ways, and they happened at different times, so it is movable as well. The only thing he didn't change is that it happened. She adds,
Without her death, you would never have defeated Dormammu and become the Sorcerer Supreme and the Guardian of the Eye of Agamotto.
except that isn't true, because all of those things happened in the main timeline, without Christine dying. Strange believes this, though, so that leads him to the conclusion.
I'm creating a paradox.
So now it's time to talk about the time travel, because they didn't explain it well at all. In the MCU, there are timelines, as we know from Endgame and Loki. However, when Doctor Strange uses the Time Stone to travel, he doesn't create a new timeline. As he said earlier, the stone allows for
manipulation and alteration of timelines.
which means he is going back to change the past of his own timeline, in a system that opens up the possibility for the grandfather paradox. This is what absolute points prevent from happening. Or is it? The grandfather paradox is the paradox in which changing a certain thing about the past makes it so that you would have never traveled back to change that thing in the first place. It's named after the thought that if in this time travel system you killed your own grandfather before your father was born, you would never be born and thus would have never traveled back to kill him, breaking all logic. But here's the thing. The version of you that traveled back to change things was a very specific version of you. Any changes you make that affect your past self will end up changing the you that traveled back, making it not the same you. So anything Doctor Strange changes, which is a lot, will result at best in a different version of himself traveling back in time. Thus, everything in his life should be an absolute point. Strange changes a number of things, which should be causing the paradox absolute points are meant to avoid. But let's say it's loose, and it just has to be some version of Doctor Strange that travels back, and no change he makes prevents that from happening, but saving Christine would. So what this means is that there is one definitive outcome that will happen from a given starting point, and Christine has to die so that Strange will eventually travel back, which prevents the paradox. But that's just not true, because timelines exist. When Strange is done changing the past, there will be some timelines coming off of it where he does travel back to this point, and some where he doesn't. This will be the case whether Christine dies or not. Her dying is not the only thing that could lead to him traveling there. What if one of the infinite Stranges from the possible timelines that play out just wants to revisit this moment for whatever reason? It doesn't have to be the same Strange that travels back, because if it did, he already broke that in a ton of ways. So all of that is already broken. But then there's the fact that there is the possibility of timelines coming off of this point that must all be wiped, because Strange, in the action of traveling back, is changing things, and thus removing the past that many timelines, including the one he came from, rely on. So that means that the bartender reacting to him doesn't make sense, because that timeline should be wiped as soon as he is in the past. If none of that made any sense, then in short, time is utterly shattered, and the time travel doesn't make sense in multiple ways. The Ancient One continues with,
You're risking the universe. You cannot reverse an absolute point.
Strange argues that she doesn't know that because books have been lost, but she tells him that there is no hope, and that
This path only leads to darkness and the end of this reality.
she says that if he does this, she will be forced to stop him, to which he responds,
You'd have to find me first.
before using the time stone to travel away as she attacks him with magic of some sort. When Strange arrives in the past, he checks behind the Eye of Agamotto to see that his clothing was charred. But why would the Ancient One risk killing him if that would cause the very paradox she wants him to avoid? And how can he travel to a place he has never been, wearing the clothes he was wearing before traveling, when the time travel makes him take over the body of his past self? This point in time is way before he was even born, as we learn later. How can he travel here with how we've seen the travel to work earlier? Well, anyway, he sees a guy and tries to talk to him, then follows him when he walks away. This leads to him seeing the library he was looking for. But how did he know when and where to travel when the lost library of Cagliostro is, lost? The library is high up on a cliff, thus he would have to portal to get there. But he doesn't have a sling ring, right? Well, he makes the portal anyway, and it's not even like the Eye of Agamotto, where it just pops out of nowhere when past him wouldn't have had it on his person. He clearly just doesn't have a sling ring. And it's not like the invisible Eye of Agamotto from earlier either, because he wasn't wearing a sling ring before he traveled. When he is up there, he sees I'll just call it a rune, because I don't know what it is. He throws some debris onto it, sees that it gets eaten up by blue flames, then deactivates the rune. He walks forwards only for a bunch of runes to pop up, making him fall through the floor, and despite that far fall, he is fine. Phase 4 really ruined the concept of glass cannon, didn't it? But with how much continuity they shattered, I guess instead it presented us with a lot of glass cannon. The guy Strange saw earlier walks up, comments on Strange's outfit being weird, to be met with the response,
It's Armani.
Then, after introducing himself as Obang and starting to walk off with Strange, he refers to Strange as
Sorcerer Armani?
Strange responds,
No, it's strange.
and Obeng responds,
Not any stranger than any other name in this world.
they really just ripped the best joke from Doctor Strange and made it worse. Obeng leads Strange to the library. But wait a second, what's the point of a trap that makes you fall if it drops you to a spot where you can just walk to the entrance of the library anyway? While Strange starts sorting through the books with telekinesis far beyond we've ever seen him do. We've seen him do some kind of wind spells in Infinity War and Endgame, but those had orange circles come up around his wrists, and weren't even close to as precise as what he's doing here. He uses it to sort through the books, and find one on breaking absolute points, which tells him he needs a lot of power, which can be achieved by getting it from other beings. He starts with a familiar face. Well, not exactly a face, but it's a tentacle monster just like we saw in episode 1, maybe even the same one. He asks for it to share some of its power, but it attacks him and he blacks out, waking up to Obeng helping him with his injuries. With how quickly he was being flung around by it, he probably shouldn't have survived, or at the very least should be more injured than he was. Again. Obeng asks him,
Is she worth the pain?
following up with,
A man does not suffer like this for his own glory.
Strange could be doing this for any number of reasons. Assuming there is some single she that he's doing it for is a big jump. Even if you don't think he could be doing this for his own glory, he could be trying to fix a mistake from his past, or save the world. He's right that there is a specific woman he's doing it for, but he doesn't have the logic for getting there. Strange responds,
Every moment of it.
so Obeng warns him that
Love can break more than your heart. It can shatter your mind.
Strange goes back to searching for power, now absorbing things instead of asking them for power. This time, he starts with a little gnome thing, and next pulls in a bug whose cape he steals, but he doesn't absorb it because
I draw the line of bugs.
he goes through a bunch more beings, taking some of their qualities each time. The Watcher is in the background and talks to us, saying,
I could warn him, intervene, but the fate of his universe is not worth risking the safety of all others.
which is a line I will come back to later. After the Watcher says this, Strange looks at where the Watcher was and asks,
Who's that?
What? Strange can all of a sudden hear the Watcher? The Watcher has talked over things happening and has appeared in the background all the time. How did he suddenly get noticed now? Is it because he's talking while closer to Strange and he wasn't close to anyone else? Because in that case, why is he choosing to be that close if that can alert Strange to his existence? Or is it because Strange is more powerful? Not that that makes any sense. Being more powerful isn't just going to let you see this being that is outside your level of existence. Anyway, we see a montage of Strange absorbing many creatures as a lot of time passes by, until he is finally powerful enough to absorb the tentacles off the tentacle monster he started with. After doing that, he goes to see Obeng, who has aged a lot and is nearly dead. Strange starts to open the Eye of Agamotto to reverse that, but Obeng refuses, saying,
You use magic to remain frozen for centuries. I chose to live.
Centuries? If Obeng wasn't preserving himself with magic, how did he live for centuries? Well, anyway, he says that he is willing to accept that
Even in our world, death is part of the plan.
Strange won't accept that, so Obeng says,
Maybe the other Strange will.
and when Strange is confused by this, Obeng says,
You're only half a man, living half a life.
I don't know how Obeng knows this, and why he would mention this to Strange when giving him this information gets him further down the path you know will lead to disastrous consequences. But the Watcher tells us that he's right. There's more than one Doctor Strange in this timeline. We see Wong warning Strange again, but this Strange heeds the warning. Upon going outside, he sees that everything is turning into black goop. That doesn't make any sense. The absolute point hasn't been broken yet, so why is the universe falling apart? A blue circle like the one we saw earlier appears, and out comes the Ancient One again, but she's a projection instead of actually being there. She says that she is,
A psychic impression sent through a splinter in reality.
and that's how she's here despite being dead by this point. So the blue thing is a time portal of sorts. Which begs the question, when the Ancient One talked to this episode's first Strange, we'll call him Strange Supreme, When did that Ancient One come from? If she came from the same time as he did, then she would have just used a regular portal, right? And how did she find him? Well, anyway, she explains that when Strange Supreme traveled far into the past, she summoned power from the Dark Dimension in order to split Strange into two Stranges, so that two of Strange's possible timelines could play out in the same timeline. This is getting beyond absolute nonsense at this point. This Strange isn't a possible timeline for Strange Supreme from the point that the Ancient One split him at, because Strange Supreme was already far past this point. They don't even exist at the same time. Strange Supreme traveled back centuries, so far before Strange was even born. And causing the timeline where he doesn't travel to play out leads to breaking the absolute point anyway, because the absolute point existed specifically so that he would travel in the first place and not cause a paradox. With the established rule about absolute points, he can't just choose not to travel. Strange comments,
I doubt that's the simplest or smartest thing to do.
and the Ancient One basically agrees with him by responding,
Exceedingly dangerous, actually.
so she made a terrible choice and she knows it. She could have stopped him from traveling by taking the Eye of Agamotto with a small portal or any number of spells, or even just restrained Strange's hands like Ebony Maw did in Infinity War. But instead she nearly killed him, which would have caused the paradox. In order to split him, in order to set into motion a plan that she herself admits is an exceedingly dangerous option, and doesn't deny that it wasn't the simplest or smartest thing to do. She also says that if Strange Supreme breaks the absolute point,
The resulting temporal paradox will destroy this universe.
so it will destroy the universe. Then why, when talking to Strange Supreme, did you initially word it as a possibility and not a guarantee, saying it's risking the universe, not that it will be definitively doomed when the absolute point is broken? With how experienced and clever the Ancient One was in the past, we now have yet another character who is out of character to add to the list. After she says that he's the only hope, we see him and Wong talking about stopping Strange Supreme as they prepare a spell, and Wong asks,
But do you want to stop him?
Wong just questioned if Strange wants to stop an alternate version of him who has resulted in the universe falling apart? Wong would not care about the sentiment of saving Christine. The entire universe is at stake. Even if he does wonder this, bringing it up could only serve to distract Strange from saving the entire timeline. Awful, stupid question that Wong would never ask. And it's the only thing he really does this episode. Another character who is out of character. Wong says,
Guardian Vishanti, heavy-duty protection spell.
Strange is already helping you set it up. You don't need to say what you're doing, so that's a nice bit of clunky exposition. Also, a protection spell would have been very useful in everything Doctor Strange has appeared in. How has this never come up before? Strange follows up with a neat line though,
Knowing me, I'll need it.
and it makes me sad that the rest of the dialogue in this show is garbage. All of a sudden, a red circle appears under Strange and he gets pulled away, landing in the place Strange Supreme was absorbing all the creatures in. He calls out a few times with no answer, reaches for the edge of the circle to see it's some kind of barrier keeping him in. But why doesn't he have a sling ring? And he doesn't get the Eye of Agamotto either to prepare for this, when it's his most useful weapon, and Strange Supreme has one of his own. Strange wears his sling ring basically at all times, and should have been prepared for this. He calls out and asks where he is, then we see a monstrous shadow, and Strange Supreme walks out saying,
The question is, when are you?
so Strange Supreme can just casually pull people through time, seemingly without the time stone, because the circle was red, not green. Strange Supreme rants about Christine and asks other Strange to help him, then brings them both to where the car ended up crashing. As they argue about saving Christine, regular Strange says,
This isn't love. This is arrogance. This is our need to fix everything. It's what drove us to study the mystic arts in the first place.
which is like the theme about Strange needing to be the one holding the knife in Multiverse of Madness, but it's also inaccurate. Strange Supreme is clearly doing this out of love for Christine, and even if he wasn't, the need to fix everything wasn't what drove them to the mystic arts. Otherwise, both Stranges would have traveled to the past to save Christine immediately upon finding the Time Stone. Strange Supreme tries to absorb regular Strange, but the protection spell stops that, starting the fight between the two Stranges. Strange Supreme uses some kind of projectiles that arc sideways when going for the other Strange, yet they converge on the shield. Why not make them arc around the shield? There's no point directly attacking the shield you already know is there. After throwing more of the same projectile, Strange Supreme just flies through the shield, but gets electrocuted by something, and it knocks him back. Regular Strange makes shields and starts throwing them at Strange Supreme. Then he runs forward and ties Strange Supreme up, because while being rushed, Strange Supreme was... Actually, I have no idea what he was trying to do here. He was just kind of flailing and standing in place. However, Strange Supreme uses Red Lightning, which goes up the magic whip and shocks regular Strange. Strange Supreme summons some kind of monsters from the ground, which other Strange shoots down, then does some sort of long-distance tie-up move. Why would you go to tie him up with the whip if you could just do it at a distance? Before getting fully tied up, Strange Supreme sends his cloak to attack regular Strange, and it knocks his cloak off so he falls. He's obviously dead now, right? He doesn't have a sling ring on him, and his cloak is being held up by the other cloak. Well, he just makes a portal. Earlier, he didn't attempt to make a portal when captured, and you would think it's because he couldn't due to lacking a sling ring. But here, we can clearly see that he doesn't have a sling ring on either hand, and he just makes a portal anyway. This kinda breaks everything, but moving on. He also does the Wong thing from Multiverse of Madness, where he moves his momentum from falling to go sideways with a portal. And it makes even less sense here because he doesn't get flung to the side, he just immediately orients correctly and lands on his feet. The cloaks fight each other, then we return to the Stranges fighting, and they go one at a time like they're doing turn-based RPG combat. Strange Supreme uses another move which he should have done earlier, that just immediately traps regular Strange, then starts attacking him with a beam to damage his protection spell. The Cloak of Levitation gets around Strange Supreme's cloak, which is really stupid. The evil cloak just runs away when it previously was trying to block the Cloak of Levitation from entering the fight. It had no reason to stop and just leave. While the Cloak of Levitation goes to tie up Strange Supreme's hands so he can't do the beam anymore, and that allows regular Strange to break out of the things holding him down, when he couldn't earlier because... reasons. It happened off-screen of course, because they had no idea how to make this make sense. Then after Strange Supreme burns the Cloak of Levitation off of his hands, regular Strange shoots him with a powerful beam that causes a big explosion. Then it's incredibly dark all of a sudden despite there being plenty of moonlight a few seconds ago. This is just a spell Strange Supreme hasn't used yet, I guess. There is a ball of bright light where Strange Supreme was, and Strange Supreme himself is a shadow, and grabs regular Strange and pulls him into the shadow. Again, why didn't he do this earlier in the fight? It's an immediate way to take regular Strange out. Regular Strange is now in a fiery goop dimension, then he's talking to Christine, but as he starts to buy into it, he remembers Wong and the world ending, and realizes that it's not really Christine. Then Christine turns into Strange Supreme and punches him into reality with glass effects like they were in the mirror dimension. But they weren't. That's not what the mirror dimension looks like. They're falling from the sky now, and they have a fist fight as they fall, which is incredibly stupid. Strange Supreme could be using any number of spells that are more powerful than his fists, and regular Strange could use portals to save himself, as we saw earlier, even though it doesn't make any sense. Strange Supreme makes them land with regular Strange on the bottom, so it damages his protection spell, although the impact should have knocked out if not killed Strange Supreme. Then he just takes the last symbol off, which ends the protection spell, I guess. He then finally absorbs regular Strange, and opens the Eye of Agamotto, which has a different effect than usual. It turns red. I guess the dark side of the Time Stone is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural. He then takes the car apart and pulls Christine towards him, and she's alive now. I guess he influenced the Infinichlorians to create life. However, she's scared of him because he looks like a monster. The piece of the ground she backs onto starts floating, and Strange Supreme tries to stop the goop by using some sort of spell that makes a sphere of area that does something. He sees the Watcher for real this time, so I guess the Watcher revealed himself, which makes absolutely no sense with his prior motivations. His reasoning for not intervening earlier was,
The fate of his universe is not worth risking the safety of all others.
and the only possible interpretation I can pull from that is he means if Strange somehow finds out about other timelines, he could travel to them and ruin them. But he is interfering now, when Strange Supreme's own timeline is devolving into nothing, giving him more reason than ever to try to go to other timelines if he could. He can't, but for some reason, the Watcher seemed to think that interfering would cause that to happen. Wait, but as we learned in Loki, any timeline that isn't the sacred timeline will lead to multiversal war anyway, so how is interfering gonna endanger the other timelines any more than they are already endangered? The Watcher just doesn't make any sense in this episode. And you know what? He is also out of character, because he is interfering at the worst moment he could according to his own rules. He did it just to scold Strange Supreme, who tries to get the Watcher to save the world and punish him instead, but the Watcher refuses. During that conversation, Strange Supreme said,
I read about you!
But the Watcher is outside the sacred timeline. How could he influence the sacred timeline to the point where he is written about if the TVA isolated the sacred timeline? The books were written in the sacred timeline because the split happened long after they were written. I guess maybe the Watcher is beyond the scope of the TVA, and he still influences the sacred timeline. And if he doesn't interfere in a way where he is found out and written about, the timeline gets pruned. But he's not part of the timeline, so I don't know how they deal with him making the wrong choices. Anyway, Strange Supreme yells,
I didn't mean for this to happen!
Then everything is gone except his little sphere. We zoom in and see Strange Supreme inside the sphere as Christine fades into goop and Strange Supreme cries. But Strange Supreme is a part of the timeline. Why isn't he turning into goop too? Or the rock he was on? And now to step back a bit, because what we've learned brings into question something that happened earlier. If after an absolute point is broken, the entire timeline turns to goop and nothing will be left, how did Cagliostro possibly write books about how to break an absolute point? To know how to do it, he would have had to have done it, which would have ended his entire timeline. Unless he could travel back with the Time Stone to escape the timeline that's falling apart. And even if it was possible, the breaking of the absolute point would itself become an absolute point, because it's the reason you are traveling to the past. Thus, there is no possible way to escape the loop you have now created. So the books that Strange Supreme needed in order to learn how to break absolute points couldn't have possibly existed in the first place. Fantastic. We end zooming out from the sphere, and the Watcher says,
One life, one choice, one moment can destroy the entire universe.
Yeah, we just watched that happen. You don't really need to point that out. It wasn't even a malicious or bad choice either. It was just Christine choosing to come to the dinner. Is this supposed to be a moral of the story or something? Because it doesn't work. The blame would be pinned on Christine if that was the case. She was the one who made the different choice that led to all of this. Well, with the episode done, it's time to go over all of its writing aspects, which you can probably tell from what I've said so far, I'm not too happy about. The plot and world building are utter garbage. They're awful. It's hard to get worse than this. I know of some contenders, but even then, it's difficult to declare them worse with how broken everything in the episode is. The episode kicks off with a crash that happens the exact same way as it did in Doctor Strange's own movie, yet he is uninjured and Christine dies. This leads inexplicably to Strange finding the sorcerers and turning to the mystic arts, which is a hit on the world building for the sorcerers being secret. And this eventually leads to Strange using the Time Stone to travel to the past, even though that ability has never been done or even brought up in the main timeline. Probably because it was never a function of the Time Stone. He tries multiple times to save Christine, but they all end up failing. Somehow it's in different ways though. He seemingly will crash no matter how he drives. But then he just reaches the dinner or other places off screen, only for Christine to die in a different way every time they arrive somewhere. Eventually, the Ancient One shows up through a time portal thing and explains to him that saving Christine would cause a grandfather paradox, and her death is thus an absolute point in time. This ignores other instances of the grandfather paradox he would be causing, and does not mesh with the existence of timelines at all, and just generally shatters time into a million pieces. He then goes back far into the past, which doesn't line up with how his travel previously worked, and surely breaks the absolute point. Past him meeting the Ancient One then traveling back in time without replaying his past, means that his past self just disappeared at that point, so he wouldn't eventually travel, breaking the absolute point. After traveling back, he makes a portal without a sling ring, and learns how to break an absolute point from books that couldn't possibly have been written, because anyone who does break an absolute point dooms their entire timeline and can't escape. And he also demonstrates telekinesis far past anything he has ever had. As he gets the power he needs, he just notices the Watcher somehow. After gaining what he thinks is enough power, he learns that he is not the only Doctor Strange in that timeline. The supposed two timelines of Strange playing out in the same timeline is another nonsensical plot point, as they don't even exist at the same time, and what happens for the other Strange isn't a possible timeline of Strange Supreme. And it leads to the introduction of a defense spell that should have come up in the main timeline. Also, the world is already falling apart, even though the absolute point isn't broken yet. Also, as Loki established, timelines play out in real time. So New Strange couldn't have existed for only a few minutes, when Strange Supreme went through centuries, despite them being split off at the same time. Also, Strange Supreme can now just pull people through time. This ultimately leads to a fight which is just awful. Incredibly poor choices from both sides, and some things that don't make any sense, like regular Strange using portals without a sling ring. Strange Supreme wins, absorbs regular Strange, then uses some weird function of the Time Stone that I guess you unlock once you get enough power, in order to save Christine. With this whole concept of absolute points that prevent you from causing a paradox, it doesn't make any sense that there is just some arbitrary level of power that you can reach to be allowed to cause that paradox. It's a paradox, a logical impossibility. You can't just become powerful enough to ignore that. In doing so, he dooms everything to turn into goop except he himself isn't, for some reason. It's just all so bad. We have a broken plot, built on broken concepts, arrived at with broken chains of events, all built on top of broken world building. The time travel problems are what really drag it down, but everything else is terrible as well. But plot and world building aren't everything. There are also a lot of characters handled extremely poorly. The Ancient One goes with a plan that she admits is an incredibly dangerous one, and not a great option. When stopping Strange Supreme in this way was only necessary because she worded her initial extremely important warning vaguely when talking to him, hinting at the uncertainty of the timeline being destroyed, when later she is confident that it will be. And Wong, who in one of his very few lines asks Strange if he really wants to stop Strange Supreme from ending the timeline, which is currently unraveling into nothingness, so that he can save Christine when she would be, and is, devolving into nothingness along with the rest of the timeline. They managed to mess up the Watcher as well, because he chooses not to interfere for a reason that should make him choose not to interfere later, but he does. The extent of his interference is just talking to Strange Supreme, but that's what his interference would have been earlier on when he said he wouldn't, and he supposedly chose not to interfere to save all other timelines, when if Strange even found out about other timelines from the Watcher talking to him, which he wouldn't, he would have had more of a reason to go to a different timeline when his own was already falling apart. We get an original character in this episode, Obang, and he's kind of a weird one. He doesn't do much, but he for some reason leads this guy who he doesn't know to the library of Cagliostro. And his choice to tell Strange Supreme about the other Strange is just bizarre. Speaking of the other Strange, he's kind of dumb, considering he didn't grab the Eye of Agamotto in preparation for Strange Supreme. Doesn't try to escape the thing Strange Supreme traps him in by using a portal that he apparently can make without using a sling ring as he does later. And he handles the fight extremely poorly. A lot dumber than what Doctor Strange should be, So yet another one out of character. Even Strange Supreme's cloak has a weird character moment when it randomly stops trying to block regular Strange's cloak, and it's barely even a character. Also, Mordo is just erased from existence. I guess that's more of a plot thing? Not sure how to categorize that, but it's something the episode did. Christine herself seems a bit more cheery and energetic than she is in the main timeline, but that doesn't matter too much. But you've probably noticed that I haven't commented on a single action Strange Supreme did yet. Well, other than the fight. The common consensus is that his character work carries the episode despite its failures elsewhere. And if he was such a good character, he could at least save this episode from total and utter failure, worse than anything we've seen so far in the show. So, did he? Let's take a look at a scene from his first solo movie to compare. Steven is on a video call with another doctor.
I looked at all your research. I read all the papers you've sent. It's not gonna work.
While he is saying this, Strange desperately tries to take notes, but the state of his hands prevents him from doing that.
I don't think you realize how severe the damage is.
While Strange tries to say something, the doctor continues on, saying that Strange's injuries are far worse than he thinks they are. But Strange can't be convinced that he's unhealable. Admitting defeat would mean he has to give up his career for good. The other doctor follows up with,
The best I've tried and failed.
And Steven again tries to get a word out,
I understand, but just here's the thing.
but gets cut off with,
What you want from me is impossible, Steven.
The other doctor will not let Strange try to convince him because he knows that Strange's injuries are too severe to come back from, and nothing Strange says will change that. Strange tries again, only to be met with the final reason why this other doctor won't even try.
I've got my own reputation to consider.
A sentiment mirrored by Strange before the accident happened.
I have a 68-year-old female with an advanced brainstem glioma.
Yeah, you want me to screw up my perfect record?
Strange tries to stop him from hanging up, but it's no use.
I can't help you.
No.
Bonne chance, mon ami.
No, wait!
He throws all of his stuff off of the table, and right after that, Christine arrives. She immediately can tell from the tablet and papers on the floor how the call went.
He won't do it.
And Strange confirms this by slowly shaking his head. He immediately shrugs off the rejection with,
He's a hack.
The doctor he was asking to help clearly is an experienced one, if Strange is willing to reach out to him. But the second he refuses to help Strange, he's now seen as a hack. Any doctor that won't fix Strange, he sees as a hack, because he believes that he could have fixed himself, like he said earlier in the movie.
No one could have done better.
I could have done better.
But even if this was true, even if he could have fixed someone in his condition, he wouldn't even have attempted it, because that would introduce the risk of screwing up his perfect record. The exact same reason the doctor just rejected him for. It's quite a fascinating position for him to be in. Locked out of his career, because to continue it, he would need doctors to take risks that he himself would never take. One more rejection isn't stopping him though, so he starts talking through his next idea.
There's a new procedure in Tokyo. They culture donor stem cells and then harvesting them and then 3D printing a scaffold. If I could get a loan together, just...
But at the mention of a loan, Christine starts trying to argue him out of it.
Steven.
And after he says how much the loan would be...
A small loan of $1 million?
Oops, wrong clip.
Small loan, just $200,000.
Christine doesn't find that to be a good idea.
You've always spent money as fast as you can make it, but now you're spending money you don't even have.
We can see through everything he owns that he lives extravagantly. He doesn't seem to just buy things he wants or needs, but rather spends his money as quickly as he can to put on display how successful he is at his job. This irresponsible habit has come back to bite him when he is unable to work and is thus out of money when he needs it most. Christine suggests,
Maybe it's time to consider stopping.
But that's precisely what Strange doesn't want to hear, as he immediately makes as close to a regular frustrated movement as he can with his damaged hands, and replies,
No, now is exactly the time not to stop, because you see, I'm not getting any better!
He sees the only option as continuing to try, because if he waits, his condition will only get worse. Christine didn't mean that he should wait though, and gives her own take on the situation.
But this isn't medicine anymore. This is mania. Some things just can't be fixed.
And despite how much he wants to, Stephen can't argue against that, because all of his searches for ways to fix his hands have turned up fruitless. He instead opts to argue why even if there is seemingly no solution, he has to keep looking for one.
Life without my work.
But before he can go on about how he can't live without his work, Christine cuts him off because she knows that what he's about to say isn't true.
Is still life. This isn't the end. There are other things that can give your life meaning.
Strange is fixated on his career at all costs, when he has other paths he could go on with his life. And Christine sees that. But Strange pulls an implication from what she said, just to ridicule it.
Like what? Like you?
Christine is clearly caught off guard and hurt by this jab, and responds,
This is the part where you apologize.
But Strange stubbornly holds his ground.
This is the part where you leave.
As she has repeatedly challenged the one path he has chosen to follow. She complies, but Strange mocks her.
Fine. I can't watch you do this to yourself anymore.
Not too difficult for you, is it?
And despite his clear mockery, Christine responds to his question because her concern outweighs the pettiness Stephen is engaging in.
Yes, it is. It breaks my heart to see you this way.
But her genuine concern is met with contempt, as Stephen doesn't want to be looked down on, despite the terrible state he's in, because he has far too much pride for that.
No, don't pity me.
Christine again shows that she is genuinely concerned.
I'm not pitying you.
But Strange doesn't believe that.
Oh yeah, then what are you doing here? Bringing cheese and wine like old friends going for a picnic?
And his anger at this gesture that seems to him like it is that of pity leads to the follow-up.
We are not friends, Christine. We were barely lovers.
After being met with this, Christine has nothing to say, so Strange continues his rant.
But you just love a sob story, don't you? Is that what I am to you now?
Again claiming that she is only here out of pity.
Poor Stephen Strange, charity case. He finally needs me.
And ultimately claiming a motivation that he has no basis for whatsoever.
Another drag of humanity for you to work on. Patch him up and send him back into the world, hearts just humming.
He finishes with a sarcastic,
You care so much, don't you?
And Christine is nearly left speechless by his bitter and hostile rant. She can tell by now that any attempts to help him, or make him feel better, will get shot down by his ego, so she leaves.
Goodbye, Stephen.
The scene ends with Strange walking to the window, stepping on the mangled attempts to write his name on the way. This scene fantastically shows us Strange's low point, and his unwillingness to accept his injuries because of his arrogance. Every time he tries to find a solution, it turns up short. And when Christine comes to help him feel better, he shuts her out because she doesn't encourage him to keep searching for a way to heal his hands. He views the doctor at the start of the scene as a hack, because he believes that he could have fixed someone in his own state. Yet the entire reason he is like this in the first place is because he crashed his car while denying patients for the same reason. His pride in his career that led him to spend money on showy items as fast as he could stranded him with no money to use when he is in dire need of it. Everything about Strange's journey to this point is a perfectly constructed fall due to arrogance of a man who places his whole life upon his career, and wouldn't know what to do without it. Now that was one marvelous scene. But how does it compare to our main character in this episode of What If? Strange Supreme. Strange Supreme starts his journey not with a crash that injures his hands, but instead, one that kills Christine. After the crash, his hands are still fine, as the Watcher tells us,
In this universe, Stephen Strange didn't lose his hands.
So logically, he should continue being a surgeon despite his grief, right? Instead, he somehow ends up at the Mystic Arts, which doesn't make any sense for his character. In the main timeline, it was his attempts to fix his hands that led him to the Mystic Arts, because nothing else worked. But here, he just quits his job for no reason to go find the Mystic Arts. If Strange still had his hands, he would still be a surgeon, as when he starts to say,
Life without my work.
He clearly is about to say that his life is meaningless without it. And when Christine says there are other things that can give his life meaning, he says,
Like what? Like you?
Scoffing at the idea that Christine could be more important to his life than his work is, which makes sense considering how much his life centers around his career. But instead of continuing to be a surgeon, he goes on his same journey that he did in the first movie, ending with defeating Dormammu using the Time Stone. By that point in his solo movie, he had found something far bigger than himself, and had given up attempting to heal his hands, to instead practice the mystic arts. And despite this being Strange's reaction to finding the mystic arts in the main timeline, Strange Supreme turns his focus away from the mystic arts to dwell in the past, despite the fact that what he is doing now is so much more important than the life of just Christine. After being warned about the dangers of the Time Stone, he did use it to defeat Dormammu, but only out of necessity. He went on to not use it again. While he tried once in Infinity War, which was a bit hasty and would have been overkill, I will admit, but it was in order to protect the stone from falling into the wrong hands, which would result in way worse than the possible side effects that could happen from him using it. But Strange Supreme forgets this lesson, using the Time Stone to time travel because, well, it's kind of unclear what his goal was, because we don't know what the book told him he could or couldn't do with the time travel, and if there were warnings that he read or not. The way it works prevents basically anything from being changed because of the grandfather paradox, or at least specific instances of the grandfather paradox that the writer arbitrarily decided on. After traveling back, he drives Christine to the event again. His method isn't very smart, as he goes down the same mountain road as last time, which he probably should avoid because of what caused the crash, and even starts thinking about passing the truck and puts on his blinker before stopping himself. They crash again, so he goes back and takes a different route this time, which is better, but he's still going dangerously fast, which is why a truck comes and hits them as he is driving. Probably should be driving more carefully if your one goal is to save Christine. On the next attempt, she gets a heart attack or something like that, so what's even the point of trying to save her anymore? You can't stop a heart attack or other similar causes of death from happening like you can a car accident, so there's no point in trying anymore, but he continues anyway. They go to pizza afterwards, but that in no way stops her from being able to have a heart attack. And with the level of telekinesis he is shown to have in the episode, how did he not stop the guy from shooting, or at least move his hand a little bit so that he misses? His next attempts all fail, and by the way, throughout all this time, he doesn't once think about using the Time Stone on Christine right after she dies in order to reverse her in time to before she died. It probably wouldn't have worked, because he has to do the thing that turns the stone red for some reason. But he has no reason to believe that he can't do that if he still believes that he can just drive differently and it will save her. In the final attempt, Christine drives. They crash, and Strange crawls out of the car to be met by the Ancient One. She gives him the information that the absolute point cannot be broken because he is creating a paradox, which he responds to with,
"I only require more power."
Which is a stupid idea. I mean, it's correct, as we find out later, because the plot of this episode is stupid. But where could the reasoning of, this is a logical impossibility, so that must mean with more power I can break it, even come from? He decides to go further into the past to find the lost library of Cagliostro. Upon meeting someone, he says,
I'm looking for the lost library of Cagliostro.
And because he gets no response, he follows up with,
Library? Hello? You know, books, reading, knowledge.
Which comes off as extremely childish and wouldn't help him at all. If this person doesn't know the word library or book, and doesn't recognize the name Cagliostro, then the word knowledge is not going to help you at all. When he arrives at the entrance to the library, he sees a rune and deactivates it. So his genius next move is to walk forward as if there's not going to be any more runes left. It's so stupid. If you already saw one, why aren't you going to check for any more? The place is guarded for a reason. They're not going to only have a single rune stopping you from entering. After finding out he can get more power through the absorption of other beings, he summons in some tentacles and for some reason tries to talk to them, which obviously doesn't work. But as we see later, he can just close the portal type thing and cut the tentacles off. So why didn't he do that the first time? In a conversation with Obang afterwards, this exchange happens.
Is she worth the pain?
Every moment of it.
So now would be a good point to talk about his primary motivation of the episode. This episode wants you to believe that Strange loves Christine so much that he would risk all of the effects of the Time Stone, plus the destruction of the entire timeline, just to prevent her from dying. But would he? Let's look back at one of the lines from the scene in Doctor Strange.
We are not friends, Christine. We were barely lovers.
Not exactly a good look for what the episode is going for. I mean, it is entirely possible that this is out of anger, and he doesn't really mean that, but we see that there is at least some truth to it. When he leaves for the Mystic Arts, he emails Christine a few times, and that's it. She never shows up again until Multiverse of Madness, where she has married another man, which, to be fair, wasn't out at the release of this episode, but she still clearly wasn't important to his life after he became a wizard. Their relationship wasn't even one that he had much investment in anyway, as we see from what Christine says.
They weren't about us, they were about you, Stephen. Everything is about you.
But all of a sudden, just like the other episodes do, they change this and hope that you've forgotten about it so that their episode works. But it doesn't work. Strange would absolutely not risk anything this drastic to get Christine back, even if he would miss her after her death. But Strange Supreme does, even when he sees that the universe is already falling apart for some reason. He fights and kills an alternate version of himself, so he has enough power to save Christine, even though it would destroy the entire universe, including Christine herself, which it does. His decisions throughout the entire fight were stupid as well. Also, he doesn't travel back to before the universe started falling apart, which he probably should have done because that's his only way to possibly escape, and he didn't even try. And the worst part is, none of this had to happen. Strange could have solved his problem without causing any paradoxes, without even traveling to the past. Remember the Time Stone's actual function, where it can be used to reverse a specific object back in time? This is a bit morbid, but he could dig Christine out of her grave and use that to bring her back to life. No time travel needed. Even if the time travel was his first option, which it shouldn't have been, when he learns he can't break absolute points, he should just return to his own time and revive Christine that way. Thus, she still died in his past, and he just brought her back to life now. This would avoid the paradox, because nothing about his past changed. She merely is alive in the present. So all of what he did in this episode at this point seems like it doesn't work. He is an idiot, his motivations and decisions throughout the entire episode are botched. But maybe we can justify it with Strange's primary character trait, arrogance. As I said in the scene I analyzed, Strange is absolutely an arrogant character, and it comes back to bite him. I've seen people use arrogance to justify a lot of things, because they seem to think it's a catch-all for justifying character decisions. Arrogance does not mean stupidity. You may take some risks, like answering calls and looking at files while you're in the car. But what he does in this episode is various levels of stupid and insane. Arrogance doesn't cover any of that either. He was explicitly told he would destroy the universe by saving Christine, and sees it in progress. No amount of arrogance is going to make him double down on saving her, no matter how much he cares about her. Even if he cared about her more than the rest of the universe, she would be destroyed along with that universe anyway. So, Strange Supreme is our 5th assassination by proxy of the show. And this episode is a complete failure in terms of characters as well. How delightful. But do you want to know my real hot take? I would argue not just that Strange Supreme was assassinated, but that this is the worst assassination of Doctor Strange we've seen in the MCU up to now. In No Way Home and Multiverse of Madness, he was handled insanely badly, but destroying his entire timeline to save someone he didn't even care about enough to justify that?
We are not friends, Christine. We were barely lovers.
On top of having a better solution that he should have thought to use and making a ton of stupid decisions, that just hasn't been topped. But if you really think about it, this episode is an allegory for the state of the MCU. The writers are Strange Supreme, trying so many times to get the story they want, but having no successful attempts. We are the watcher, observing this all as it happens. The writers eventually have to resort to breaking continuity, or absolute points in the canon, if you will. And we are forced to watch without interfering, as the world and the writing slowly coalesce into a totality of Marvel sludge. In short, episode bad. An easy 1 out of 10, and the bottom of the list so far. In fact, it's the worst thing I've covered on my channel. For now. See you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.